Cool. So hopefully you guys got an opportunity to work through a lot of this and kind of play around with Rails again and adding in some new models and adding in some data. I made a recap and I'll post this online as well. But you see that. So I'm gonna also send out a reflection survey. Um, Basically, what it is just three things that you learned today, two things you found interesting, and one question you still have. This is for both you to kind of figure out and reflect on what you learned, and then for me to figure out what we need to work on, what I can help you guys do better with. So fill this out afterwards. That'd be super helpful. Um, but hopefully you guys got a chance to work in pairs today. What were your thoughts on pair programming? What were some things you all liked? What worked well?
I think it's better.
You think it's faster? That's good. Why?
Some, another one's read the document and another one's type the thing. And maybe two people can figure out faster the bug or something wrong in our code.
Definitely. And that's a nice thing to learn from each other. What didn't you like? What did not go well? Nothing?
I think it would have been nice if we would have created our own branch because we kept deleting my
Okay.
database and
Yeah.
adding it.
So there's definitely an element of working with each other, dependency management, not stepping each other's toes. Great. So we created our models. We created Heroku. Playing around with the Rails console. Can someone explain to me the difference between photo.save and photo.save with the bang? Who knows the difference? Say it again. If the photo already exists in the database, both of them will still update the record. Yeah. Remember last time we talked about how if there's a failure, right, photo.save returns just true or false. So if the operation was successful, it'll return true. Otherwise, it returns false. And so you have to kind of be aware that it could still return a valid answer if the answer is just false. Photo.save with the bang, the exclamation mark is Ruby called bang. If it fails, it'll blow up and throw an exception. So it won't just silently return false, it'll stop, and so it's very obvious that it did not go through. And then here are just some other helper methods to kind of check if it's a new record or not. If you create a new record and don't save it, there won't be an ID field. You can check that. You also can check persisted or new record, and those kind of give you an indication whether or not it's been saved before, or it's just an instance that you've created but you haven't yet saved. We also then created some fixtures and loaded those into the database. We also then later on used Rails DB seed. Can someone explain to me why you may want to use DB seed as opposed to fixtures? Who wants to answer that question? So when you go to fixtures, let's see if I can pull this one up. This one doesn't have it. So with DB fixtures, you notice that you explicitly have to lay out everything you want to include in the database, right? You say, first photo, the username, the image, right? It's all laid out very clearly. But it doesn't lend itself well to programmatic attempts, right? It's not Ruby code. It's YAML, which is like a data formatting system. So you kind of have to explicitly lay things out one by one. In DB seed, you can use Ruby code. So you can add in complex logic. You can add in loops, conditionals. Remember last time we said if we already have data in the system, don't create new data, right? You kind of add that logic in the DB seed. In fixtures, it doesn't really have that complexity. Fixtures was designed for tests so that when you run a test, you have a clean slate of data every time, and you can clearly see what your data is. DB seed was designed more for development, just seeding in data, so you have something to work with. So you create your views, it's not just an empty view. One of the things you may have noticed with DB fixtures is that it actually erases the old data and replaces it, which is useful for tests. Maybe not so useful if you're developing on your own. So Rails lets you take the fixtures and put it into the development database, but the real purpose of it is more for testing, and DB seed is more for development database. Great. So we continued on, created a controller for photos. Hopefully everyone was able to see some photos on their views. You notice that if you define resources photos, right, it gives you a whole bunch of routes. And it's the same as manually typing out all these routes, right? These are all RESTful routes. So, create, update, destroy, as well as your Rails route. So you get an edit, right, which gives you the ability, like an edit form to edit a view, that sort of thing. We also experimented with partials, and you see here that there's multiple ways of doing the same thing. This is, again, with Ruby and Rails, a lot of times there's many ways to do the same thing. So you could, have a loop like this, where you say, for each photo, go ahead and call the partial, render it. There's also Ruby magic, and so there's a shortcut for everything. You can even just go ahead and with one line, just say render it, and if you already have the file named correctly, it'll know how to pull it up. And so a lot of times, you can be more explicit, you can lay things out one by one, or if you really want to, you can use the Ruby magic and let it work for you. The downside is, if the Ruby magic doesn't work, then maybe sometimes you're left scratching your head. But it's definitely something to always consider. One other thing is in the loop, if you decide to do the loop, don't put an equal sign there. I made that mistake in the last lecture, and what happens? Well, it'll print out the output of photos.each, right? And photos.each, what is the output? It's just the array itself, so it'll return photos. So if you have the equal sign, it'll actually print out what's there. So in this case, you don't want that equal sign. You want it to just go through the Ruby code. Then we went on and talked more about seeds and creating the seed data. How many of you were able to actually create some seed data using Faker? Okay. How many of you first looked at the hint? What hint? So for those who looked at the hint, right, the hint kind of looked like this. It basically tried to get some data, the top photos from Imgur, and add them to our database. And you notice it uses Faker for username, some caption, but the URL, right, comes from Imgur. And then it also down here creates some comments. So what happens if we run that, right? So we're here in our application, right? We'll run Rails DB seed, and we'll see it create, with any luck, unexpected keyword in line 19.
I think you're missing him.
Timed up. Yeah, thank you.
31.
Okay.
Yeah.
31. Okay.
I think, yeah, it's missing prem. Thank you. All right, so we'll go ahead and run that. And, right, it'll create a bunch of data for us. Great. So now if we actually go ahead and load our web page, which is here, what do we get? A bunch of image not requested. So it looks like some images worked. A lot of things didn't. I think Imgur has some new authorization that they added in. So a lot of the images come back with not being able to access them. So that's no fun. So let's go ahead and change that. So we'll open up a Rails console. All right, and we say photo.count. We have 60, and that makes sense because the API returns 60 to us. So we want to redo that because we want to add in some actual photos. So let's go ahead and delete all of those. Right? So we say photo.all, which would access all of them, and we're going to map them to each. And we're going to have our block, right? So we're going to say to each one, let's go ahead and destroy it. If we call it just .destroy and it doesn't destroy it because for whatever reason, it'll just return false, right? We want to actually make sure it destroys all of them. Let's go ahead and do that. And here we see it destroys all of them. Great. So now if we try to take a look at the count again. It's 0. Great. So now we want to create some actual photos. So we're going to get rid of some of this Imgur code, and let's just do this, our own way. So 60.times, right? We're going to say our own time. Let's just create 60 photos. We now need to supply a URL. So we'll go back to Faker, and we could use the avatar data set. Let's see how to use it, right? Just .image, and returns to us a URL. Great. So we'll add that in. Great, we have a bunch of information. We don't need this section anymore. This was a case the Imgur API didn't return to us a URL. Great, so now we basically say 60 times. Let's go ahead and create a bunch of photos. And then for each photo, we'll also create some random number of comments. And rand5 just means give me a random number between 0 and 4, actually, because it applies a modulo 5 division to the random number. And what's nice about this is rather than having to define 60 times, via copy paste in the fixtures file, all of our information, we can write Ruby code that does it for us. So now that we have it set up, let's go ahead and run Rails DB seed, and it'll go ahead and add all of these models to our database. Fantastic. Let's confirm that it actually went through. So we'll open up a console, and we'll say photo.count. Great, there's 60. Let's just inspect the last one. So we'll say photo.count.last. Oops, all.last. Thank you. Photo.all.last. And there we go. Looks pretty good. And so let's go ahead and refresh and see what happens. And now we get a bunch of avatars. Some actual images, which is neat. And some comments, which is all great. We also created, in the seed file, created at, right? We did some random date between now and a year ago, right? But if you look at the output, it kind of formats it nicely, right? It doesn't say in Ruby time, Saturday, March 24th or something. It's actually, 5 months ago or something. And that's just another Rails helper. Right, Rails includes a lot of helper sets. This one is just time ago in words. It's a function, so you can call it, because in Ruby you can just pass functions, you can pass arguments just afterwards. So you can call it like that, and that works. Or it's a function, so you can give it the function syntax. It's just different style. I linked at the end of the last lecture to the Airbnb style guide. It's kind of a nice Ruby style guide that kind of consolidates things down. And in that style guide, they always prefer to say, when you have a method, actually use the parentheses and don't just pass in things like that. But again, it's a style preference. There really is no dominant way to do it. It's really just a matter of the team you're working on, your own style, and the company you're with. Great. So that took us through all of the seed, and then finally for those who create comments, right? Similar thing as before, we have a relationship. So we have a photo has many comments, and then a comment belongs to photo, and that lets us query one from the other, right? So if we go back into our Rails console, we can say photo equals photo.last. Just gonna grab a photo, and we can actually say photo.comments, right? And we can directly query the comments. And that's because we've gone ahead and defined this relationship here. A photo has many comments. And that's just part of Rails. This is something we didn't do last time, but it's a good practice. Dependent destroy. Essentially what it means is if you have a photo model, it'll have a bunch of comments that relate to it. What happens if you delete the photo, right? It's gone from the database row. The photo's gone. But now you have a bunch of comments that still exist that link to a photo that doesn't. Right? So you have a bunch of comments in the database. The comment will have a photo ID on it, and that'll point to a photo, but we just deleted that photo. So now the comments are useless. There's no way really that we need them anymore, but they still take up rows and space in our database. So by adding in dependent destroy, if we delete the photo, it'll also delete its comments. And that's just nice because it keeps our data consistent. A lot of the times you'll want to do that yourself in the logic. So if you were to call photo.destroy, you would also want to say, all right, go ahead, find its comments and destroy them. But if you forget to do that, or you're lazy, Rails can do that for you with dependent destroy. And that's just a nice way to keep your data consistent. All right, so fantastic work, everyone. Good job tonight. Remember, the homework is due when? Sunday at midnight. Great. Don't be, don't put it off to the end. And yeah, we'll stick around for questions after. But thanks, everyone, and we'll see you all Monday.